Black woman wearing a badge? That's hilarious.
Driver's license. You don't arrest the sheriff's son.
Step back or you're under arrest.
A black woman wearing a badge. Dylan Whitmore scoffed as he grabbed Officer Aaliyah Carter's wrist and deliberately slapped her citation book onto the asphalt. Loose pages scattered across the gas station parking lot while he laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. You honestly think a black cop gets to put handcuffs on the sheriff's son? He mocked, looking around for the crowd's approval. You're wearing a uniform, but around here you're still the outsider. Several people lowered their eyes. No one dared interrupt. Dylan stepped even closer, tightening his grip around Aaliyah's wrist. My father runs this county, he sneered. Every deputy here answers to him. By sunset, you'll be cleaning out your locker. He shoved her shoulder with a careless grin. Go ahead, he taunted. Call for backup. They'll salute me before they ever listen to you. Aaliyah glanced once at his hand, gripping her wrist. Release my arm, she said evenly. Dylan laughed. Or what? His smile disappeared 6 seconds later. With one precise defensive movement, Aaliyah broke his grip, redirected his balance, and pinned him face down against the pavement. Before the stunned crowd could process what had happened, steel handcuffs clicked shut around Dylan's wrists. The entire parking lot fell silent. Then a convoy of sheriff's vehicles came speeding toward the scene. If you believe no family name should ever be above the law, stay with us until the very end. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. And if stories of courage, justice, and resilience inspire you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happens next. Hi there, some of my favorite memories began because I decided to stay 5 minutes longer than planned. 5 days earlier, Officer Aaliyah Carter drove into Redstone County beneath a pale autumn sunrise, her patrol cruiser rolling slowly past weathered storefronts and faded American flags that fluttered lazily above Main Street. It looked like the kind of small southern town where neighbors greeted each other by name and children still rode bicycles until sunset. But appearances, she had learned long ago, were often the best disguise. As she parked outside the Redstone County Sheriff's Office, conversations inside the building abruptly stopped. Several deputies glanced toward the entrance. Someone whispered quietly, "So that's the new officer. The one from Atlanta. I heard she's former Army." Another deputy shrugged. "Doesn't matter. She won't last a month." Aaliyah ignored the murmurs. She straightened the neatly pressed collar of her uniform before stepping inside with quiet confidence. Her years in the U.S. Army Military Police had taught her that respect was earned through discipline, not demanded through rank. Captain Denise Monroe was already waiting. Unlike the others, she greeted Aaliyah with a firm handshake. "Welcome to Redstone." "Thank you, Captain." Denise studied her for a brief moment. "I've read your file." "I hope that's a good thing." "It is." A faint smile crossed Denise's face. "You've never had a sustained complaint." "No, ma'am." "You've received 3 commendations for refusing unlawful orders." "Yes, ma'am." Denise nodded slowly. "That tells me 2 things." Aaliyah waited. "You know how to do the right thing. And you also know how expensive doing the right thing can become." The room fell silent. Before Aaliyah could respond, the front doors burst open. A young man wearing designer sunglasses strode confidently through the lobby. He didn't even acknowledge the deputies. Instead, every deputy acknowledged him. "Morning, Dylan." "Good to see you." "How's your father?" Dylan Whitmore barely looked at them. His confidence wasn't earned. It was inherited. He tossed a set of truck keys onto the front desk. "My truck's blocking the fire lane." One deputy immediately hurried outside. "I'll move it for you." Aaliyah watched without saying a word. No civilian should expect law enforcement to valet his vehicle. Yet nobody questioned it. Dylan finally noticed the unfamiliar face. He slowly removed his sunglasses. So, he looked Aaliyah up and down with open amusement. "You're the new officer." "Officer Aaliyah Carter." He ignored the offered introduction. "I've never seen you around here." "I just transferred." He smirked. "Then here's some free advice." The lobby grew quiet again. "You'll save yourself a lot of trouble if you learn one thing fast." Aaliyah folded her hands behind her back. "I'm listening. My father is Sheriff Randall Whitmore." His grin widened. "When the Whitmores tell you something, you don't argue." A deputy nearby chuckled nervously. Another looked down at his boots. No one challenged him. Aaliyah simply answered, "I enforce state law." Dylan laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You'll figure it out." As he walked away, Captain Denise Monroe watched the entire exchange without saying a word. Only after Dylan disappeared did she quietly speak. "Don't underestimate him." "I don't." "Good. Should I underestimate his father?" Denise looked toward the sheriff's office upstairs before answering. "No." The answer carried more weight than Aaliyah expected. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah began her first patrol through the county. The farther she drove from downtown, the more stories she heard. An elderly mechanic quietly warned her while repairing a patrol tire. "People around here don't file complaints against the Whitmores. Why not? They disappear." A waitress refilling her coffee lowered her voice. "Last year, my cousin reported Dylan for wrecking her mailbox while driving drunk." "What happened?" "She ended up apologizing to him." Another customer leaned closer. "Everyone knows Dylan races down Highway 17 almost every weekend." "No tickets." The man laughed bitterly. "Tickets. They escort him home." Every conversation sounded unbelievable. Yet every person told the same story. Different faces, different places, the same fear. Late that evening, Aaliyah parked beside a quiet overlook to finish paperwork. Deputy Caleb Foster pulled in beside her. He seemed nervous. "You settling in?" "I'm trying." He hesitated. "I heard what Dylan said this morning. It doesn't matter." "It should." Caleb sighed heavily. He's never been told no his entire life. Someone eventually has to. Caleb looked toward the dark highway stretching across the hills. "You don't understand. Then help me." He rubbed the back of his neck. "When Dylan gets stopped, he doesn't get arrested. When Dylan fights, no charges. When Dylan drinks, someone else gets blamed." Aaliyah stared through the windshield. "And everyone accepts that. They've learned to." She turned toward him. "I didn't transfer here to learn bad habits." For the first time that day, Caleb almost smiled. "You really mean that?" "I do." His expression quickly became serious again. "Just then be careful." "Why?" "Because this county doesn't punish people for breaking the rules. It punishes people who enforce them." The words lingered long after Caleb drove away. Night settled over Redstone County. The roads grew quieter. Aaliyah resumed her patrol. 10 minutes later, her radar suddenly flashed. 94 miles per hour. In a 55-mile-per-hour zone, a black lifted pickup truck roared past her cruiser, weaving recklessly between two family vehicles before disappearing around a bend. Aaliyah activated her emergency lights without hesitation. Blue and red reflections exploded across the empty highway. She pressed the accelerator. The pickup slowed only after nearly 2 miles. As Aaliyah stepped out of her cruiser, the driver's door opened. Even before she could see his face, she recognized the expensive sunglasses. Dylan Whitmore smiled as if the traffic stop were nothing more than a private joke. Behind him, the flashing patrol lights painted the highway in alternating shades of blue and red. Neither of them knew that within minutes the encounter would ignite the biggest scandal Redstone County had ever witnessed. The flashing blue lights reflected across the polished black paint of Dylan Whitmore's lifted pickup as it rolled to a lazy stop on the shoulder of Highway 17. Instead of lowering his window, Dylan climbed out with a grin that suggested he believed he was greeting an old friend rather than facing a traffic stop. Officer Aaliyah Carter remained beside her patrol vehicle. "Good evening," she called in a calm, professional voice. "Please return to your vehicle." Dylan ignored her completely. He adjusted his expensive watch before slowly walking toward her. I was wondering how long it would take before the new officer tried to make a name for herself. Aaliyah didn't move. "For your safety and mine, return to your vehicle." Again he laughed. "You really don't know where you are." She kept her tone even. "I clocked your vehicle at 94 miles per hour in a 55 zone. So, you crossed the center line twice. And, Tutasa, you endangered other drivers." Dylan shrugged as though she had commented on the weather. "You finished. I'll need your driver's license registration and proof of insurance." Instead of reaching for his wallet, Dylan slipped both hands into his pockets. "No." Aaliyah looked directly into his eyes. "Excuse me, I said no." The wind swept across the empty highway as headlights from passing cars illuminated the tense scene. "You don't get to demand anything from me," Dylan continued. "Not in this county." Aaliyah took a slow breath. "Your failure to provide identification during a lawful traffic stop will result in additional charges." He smiled wider. "You know what happens every time someone tries this." She waited. "My father gets a phone call." He took another step closer. "The ticket disappears." Another step. "The officer apologizes." One more. And life goes on. His confidence was absolute. Years of privilege had convinced him that consequences were something reserved for other people. Aaliyah remained exactly where she was. "This is your final lawful order. Return to your vehicle. Provide your identification." Dylan folded his arms. "Make me." Silence settled over the roadside. Then another patrol vehicle pulled in behind Aaliyah. Deputy Caleb Foster stepped out. His expression immediately changed when he recognized Dylan. "Oh no." Dylan laughed loudly. "Perfect timing." He pointed toward Caleb. "Tell her who I am." Caleb hesitated. "Dylan." "No." Dylan interrupted him. "Tell the rookie." Caleb looked at Aaliyah, then at Dylan. His shoulders seemed to sink beneath an invisible weight. He stopped himself. Aaliyah answered instead. "I already know exactly who he is." Dylan smirked. "Then you know this traffic stop is over?" "No." The single word caught everyone by surprise. "It has just begun." Aaliyah removed her citation book. "I'm issuing citations for reckless driving, excessive speeding, and failure to obey a lawful order." Dylan stared at the ticket book as if it were a personal insult. "You actually think you're writing me a ticket?" "I do." He burst into laughter. Passing drivers began slowing. Within minutes, several people stood near the edge of the highway watching. Phones appeared. Someone whispered, "That's Sheriff Whitmore's son." Another answered, She has no idea what she's doing. Dylan glanced toward the growing audience before deciding to make a spectacle of it. He stepped directly into Aaliyah's personal space. "You know why people here respect my family?" She didn't answer. "They're smart." His voice grew louder. "You should try it." He leaned close enough that only she could hear his next sentence. "You should have stayed in the city. Around here, a black officer doesn't tell the Whitmores what to do." Several people nearby lowered their eyes. Caleb looked visibly uncomfortable. Aaliyah's expression never changed. "The law applies equally to everyone." Dylan rolled his eyes dramatically. "There you go again." He suddenly slapped the citation book out of her hands. The booklet struck the pavement. Loose pages scattered across the shoulder. Gasps spread through the small crowd. Dylan looked around proudly. "There, now write another one." Aaliyah slowly bent to retrieve the papers. She carefully gathered each page without saying a word. Her calmness somehow irritated Dylan more than anger ever could. "You don't get it." He laughed again. "My father built this department. He hires people. He fires people. You'll be unemployed before breakfast." Aaliyah closed the citation book. "You've now interfered with a law enforcement officer during a lawful stop." His grin widened. "Are you arresting me?" "Yes." The crowd collectively inhaled. Caleb took one uncertain step forward. "Dylan." But it was already too late. Aaliyah reached for her handcuffs. "Turn around." Dylan stared at the cuffs for nearly 2 seconds. Then he laughed harder than ever. "This is adorable." He extended his wrists mockingly before suddenly pulling them away. "No." He jabbed a finger toward her badge. "You don't arrest me." She spoke clearly enough for everyone recording to hear. "Sir, you are resisting a lawful arrest." He stepped closer instead. "I said no." Aaliyah reached for his arm. In an instant, Dylan violently grabbed her wrist. His fingers tightened around her sleeve. "You really don't understand, do you?" He yanked her toward him. "You can't arrest me." Everything happened at once. Years of military police training took over. Aaliyah rotated her captured wrist to break the pressure on the joint. She stepped diagonally across Dylan's stance. One controlled movement redirected all of his momentum. His feet left the pavement. A second later, he landed chest first against the asphalt with a stunned grunt. Before anyone could react, Aaliyah secured his right arm behind his back. Her knee stabilized his shoulder without unnecessary force. The handcuffs clicked shut. One, then the other. Exactly 6 seconds had passed. No shouting, no panic, no excessive force. Only precise textbook defensive tactics. The highway fell completely silent. Even Dylan seemed unable to understand what had just happened. His cheek pressed against the pavement as disbelief slowly turned into rage. "You'll pay for this!" He struggled uselessly. "My father." The distant sound of multiple sirens suddenly interrupted him. Everyone turned toward the highway. 3 black sheriff's office SUVs sped toward the scene with emergency lights flashing. The lead vehicle braked hard. Sheriff Randall Whitmore stepped out before the engines had fully stopped. His eyes immediately found his son lying in handcuffs beneath the knee of Officer Aaliyah Carter. For one long frozen moment, nobody moved. Then the sheriff slowly removed his sunglasses. His face hardened with fury. "What?" he said in a voice cold enough to silence the entire roadside. "Do you think you're doing to my son?" No one answered Sheriff Randall Whitmore immediately. The flashing emergency lights painted the highway in alternating waves of blue and red, while dozens of cell phones continued recording. Officer Aaliyah Carter remained exactly where department policy required her to be. One knee stabilized Dylan Whitmore's shoulder. One hand rested lightly on the secured handcuffs. Her voice remained calm. Your son was lawfully stopped for reckless driving, excessive speeding, refusing to identify himself, interfering with a traffic stop, and assaulting a police officer. Randall looked at Dylan, then back at Aaliyah. I didn't ask for a report. His tone became colder. I asked what you think you're doing. Aaliyah met his stare without hesitation. My job. Several deputies standing behind the sheriff exchanged nervous glances. No one could remember the last time someone had spoken to Randall Whitmore without fear. Dylan twisted against the pavement. Dad, get her off me! Randall took 2 slow steps forward. Officer Carter. He deliberately ignored her rank. Remove those handcuffs. No, sir. The answer came so quickly that it caught everyone off guard. Randall's jaw tightened. I gave you a direct order. You are not my commanding officer during an active arrest. The crowd collectively held its breath. Even Deputy Caleb Foster looked as though he wished he could disappear. Randall's voice rose. That is my son. Aaliyah answered just as firmly. At this moment, he is my prisoner. For several long seconds, neither moved. The sheriff finally turned toward Caleb. Deputy. Caleb swallowed hard. Remove those cuffs. Every eye shifted toward the young deputy. His hands trembled slightly. He looked at Dylan, then at Aaliyah. Finally, he lowered his eyes. I can't do that, Sheriff. Randall stared at him in disbelief. What did you say? Caleb forced himself to speak louder. The arrest appears lawful. The words landed like a thunderclap. Dylan exploded. You coward! You work for my father! Randall slowly removed his campaign-style sheriff's hat. His expression had changed completely. Cold, controlled, dangerous. So that's how it's going to be. He stepped close enough that only Aaliyah could hear. You've been in my county less than a week. She remained silent. I've buried officers with longer careers than yours. Another pause. Think very carefully about what happens next. Without another word, Randall turned toward the gathered crowd. Everyone clear the roadway. Within minutes, Dylan was loaded into the rear of Aaliyah's patrol vehicle. The sheriff watched every second. Not once did he offer assistance. Not once did he acknowledge the law. He simply watched, as though memorizing the face of the woman who had embarrassed his family. The booking process at the county detention center was painfully quiet. Every correctional officer recognized Dylan. Some looked shocked. Others looked frightened. One booking officer whispered under his breath, I never thought I'd see this day. Aaliyah completed every report exactly as procedure required. Body camera footage, witness list, evidence log, medical assessment, use of force documentation. Every blank line was filled, every signature completed, every detail carefully recorded. She had learned years ago that paperwork often became the strongest defense against powerful people. As she placed the completed file onto the records counter, a familiar voice interrupted. Officer Carter. Captain Denise Monroe stood in the hallway. I need a word. Inside her office, Denise closed the door before speaking. You followed policy. Yes, ma'am. You stayed professional. Yes, ma'am. Denise nodded. Good. Aaliyah waited. Because tomorrow they'll accuse you of doing exactly the opposite. The words settled heavily between them. They already have. Denise gave a tired smile. The sheriff's office has received 6 complaints in the last hour. 6. 3 anonymous witnesses claim you used excessive force. Aaliyah frowned. The incident was recorded. I know. The body camera captured everything. I know. So did at least 20 cell phones. I know. Denise folded her arms. But facts don't spread as fast as rumors. By sunrise, the entire county seemed to be talking about only one thing. Not Dylan's reckless driving. Not his assault on an officer. Only the image of the sheriff's son lying face down in handcuffs. Social media quickly filled with edited clips. Some videos conveniently started after Dylan was already on the ground. Others removed the moment he grabbed Aaliyah's wrist. The captions were even worse. New officer attacks local resident. Out-of-town cop abuses sheriff's family. Power-hungry rookie crosses the line. Watching the manipulated videos, Aaliyah realized someone was working quickly. Too quickly. Someone wanted to control the story before the truth could. The retaliation began before noon. Her patrol assignment was changed without explanation. Instead of normal highway duty, she was ordered to cover isolated back roads alone. Her next 2 weeks of scheduled days off disappeared from the roster. Her overtime request was denied. Even her locker had been quietly moved to the far end of the building. Small actions. Petty actions. But together they carried one message. You don't belong here. As she walked toward her cruiser after briefing, she stopped abruptly. Bright red paint dripped down the driver's side door. Across the metal, someone had sprayed 4 large words. Go back where you came from. For a long moment, Aaliyah simply looked at the vandalized patrol car. Several deputies pretended not to notice. Others quickly looked away. Only Caleb Foster walked over. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Aaliyah reached into the trunk, removed a bucket soap and a sponge. Then she began scrubbing the paint herself. Caleb stared. Aren't you angry? She continued working. Very. And then why aren't you saying anything? She finally looked up. Because that's exactly what they want. She wiped another streak of paint away. They want me distracted. Another stroke. They want me emotional. Another. They want me to quit. Caleb watched the red paint slowly disappear beneath the sponge. And will you? Aaliyah smiled for the first time that day. No. She looked directly toward the sheriff's office windows overlooking the parking lot. I've only just arrived. High above, hidden behind partially closed blinds, Sheriff Randall Whitmore stood silently watching. He believed pressure would eventually break the newest officer in his department. He had no idea that Officer Aaliyah Carter had already survived battles far more dangerous than intimidation. And somewhere inside Captain Denise Monroe's locked office, a confidential phone rang. After listening for less than 30 seconds, Denise quietly replied, "Understood." She hung up, looked toward Aaliyah through the window, and whispered to herself, "It's starting sooner than we expected." By the end of the week, Redstone County had become a town divided. Inside diners, barbershops, and grocery stores, people weren't talking about reckless driving or an officer assaulted during a lawful traffic stop. They were arguing about Officer Aaliyah Carter. The edited videos had done exactly what they were designed to do. In one clip, Dylan Whitmore appeared to be peacefully standing beside his truck, before Aaliyah suddenly forced him to the ground. The crucial moments his refusal to obey, commands his insults, and the instant he grabbed her wrist had all been removed. Thousands of people had already shared the video. The comments grew uglier by the hour. She came here looking for trouble. She wanted attention. Fire her before she hurt someone else. Even people who had never met Aaliyah suddenly believed they knew her. As she entered a neighborhood coffee shop before beginning another patrol, conversations stopped. A woman quietly pulled her young son closer. An elderly man folded his newspaper and walked away without finishing his breakfast. Only the waitress approached her. "I'm sorry," she whispered while setting down a cup of black coffee. "For what?" The waitress glanced around nervously. "For how people are treating you." Aaliyah smiled politely. "They don't know me." "No." The waitress sighed. "They only know what they've been told." Across town, Sheriff Randall Whitmore sat comfortably behind his large oak desk while a local television station replayed the edited footage. Dylan lounged in the chair opposite him, one ankle resting on his knee. "I told you she'd regret it." Randall muted the television. "Don't celebrate yet." "Dad, the whole county hates her." "They're supposed to." Randall leaned forward. "But angry people are unpredictable." Dylan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't need a mob. We need doubt." He tapped a folder lying on his desk. "If enough people question her credibility, every future report she writes becomes suspect." Dylan slowly smiled. "So we destroy her reputation." Randall answered quietly. "Exactly." Later that afternoon, Aaliyah responded to a call involving a minor traffic accident outside an elementary school. Nothing about the incident involved Dylan. Nothing involved the sheriff. Yet as soon as she stepped out of her cruiser, a man pointed his phone directly at her. "There's that officer." Within seconds, several others began recording. One woman shouted, "Don't slam anybody to the ground today." A few people laughed. Another man called out, "Maybe keep your hands to yourself this time." Aaliyah ignored every insult. She photographed the damaged vehicles, interviewed both drivers, directed traffic safely around the scene, completed the report exactly as procedure required. When she finished, an elderly woman slowly approached. "I saw what happened online." Aaliyah simply nodded. The woman reached into her purse and handed her a folded napkin. Inside was a handwritten Bible verse. "You'll need this more than I do." Before Aaliyah could thank her, the woman quietly walked away. It wasn't much, but after days of hostility, one small act of kindness reminded her that not everyone had surrendered to fear. That evening, Deputy Caleb Foster knocked on the window of Aaliyah's cruiser. "You busy? Just finishing paperwork." He climbed into the passenger seat. "I found something strange." Aaliyah waited. "The surveillance cameras at the gas station." "What about them?" The owner told everyone they malfunctioned. "And," Caleb lowered his voice, "they didn't." Aaliyah looked at him carefully. "Who has the footage?" "He won't say." "Why not?" "Because someone visited him before sunrise the morning after Dylan's arrest." Aaliyah already knew the answer. "The sheriff's office." Caleb nodded once. The owner looked terrified. "So the footage still exists?" "I think so." Hope flickered for the first time in days. If the original recording could be recovered, it would destroy every edited video spreading online. Meanwhile, Dylan refused to stay quiet. Ignoring his father's advice, he began appearing in public again. At a popular sports bar that Friday night, he proudly retold the story to a group of friends. "I almost felt sorry for her." His friends laughed. "She actually thought she was arresting you." Dylan raised his drink. "She's finished." One of the younger men hesitated. "What if the full video comes out?" Dylan's smile disappeared for only a second. It won't. How do you know my father handles problems? The confidence in his voice sounded convincing, but deep inside a small seed of uncertainty had begun to grow. Because despite all the pressure, Officer Aaliyah Carter still hadn't resigned. Near midnight, Aaliyah returned to her small rental house on the edge of town. The porch light was already on. She frowned. She distinctly remembered turning it off before leaving that morning. Slowly approaching the front steps, she noticed something resting against the front door. A large manila envelope. No stamp. No address. No fingerprints visible. Only 4 words written across the front in thick black marker. For Officer Carter, only Aaliyah carefully carried the envelope inside without opening it. She locked every door, closed every curtain. Only then did she sit at her kitchen table. Inside was a small flash drive. Nothing else. No letter, no explanation, no signature. She stared at the USB drive for several long seconds. Whoever had delivered it had taken a tremendous risk. Was it evidence a trap or the first crack in the wall of silence surrounding the Whitmore family? Outside, unseen in the darkness across the street, a parked pickup truck quietly pulled away from the curb. Someone had been watching the house, and somewhere else in Redstone County, another anonymous phone call reached Sheriff Randall Whitmore. "We've got a problem," the frightened voice whispered. "I don't think she's going to quit." The sheriff slowly smiled. "Then we'll give her a reason she can't ignore." He hung up the phone without realizing that the mysterious envelope sitting on Aaliyah Carter's kitchen table was about to change everything. Officer Aaliyah Carter didn't plug the flash drive into her personal laptop. Years of military police service had taught her a simple rule: never trust anonymous evidence until it could be examined safely. Instead, she slipped the USB drive into an evidence bag, sealed it, and drove straight to the sheriff's office before sunrise. Captain Denise Monroe was already inside. She looked up as Aaliyah entered. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Aaliyah placed the evidence bag on Denise's desk. "This was left outside my house." Denise's expression immediately hardened. "Did anyone see who delivered it?" "No." "Did you touch the drive?" "No." "Good." Denise picked up the office phone. "I need the cyber forensics workstation unlocked." 20 minutes later, they stood inside a secure digital evidence room. A forensic technician connected the flash drive to an isolated computer with no outside network access. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then folders slowly appeared on the screen. One folder was labeled Patrol Cams, another Payroll, another Call Logs, and finally, Do Not Delete. The technician frowned. "This isn't random." He opened the first folder. Dozens of patrol car videos appeared. Many carried dates stretching back nearly 4 years. Denise leaned closer. "Play 1." The screen filled with shaky body camera footage. A deputy had stopped Dylan Whitmore for driving under the influence. The timestamp was authentic. The deputy clearly said, "Mr. Whitmore, please step out of the vehicle." Before Dylan could answer, another patrol SUV arrived. Sheriff Randall Whitmore climbed out. The video continued. "No arrest," Randall ordered, but Sheriff, not the deputy, protested. He almost hit another car. "I said no arrest." The deputy reluctantly lowered his handcuffs. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. The technician clicked another file. This one showed Dylan damaging a farmer's fence after crashing his truck. Again, no arrest. Another. A fight outside a bar. Again, no arrest. One file after another revealed the same pattern. Different deputies, different victims, the same ending. Sheriff Randall Whitmore making the case disappear. Denise slowly folded her arms. This isn't just favoritism anymore. It's obstruction. Aaliyah nodded. And it's only the first folder. The technician opened the second folder. Payroll records, deputy names, overtime reports, expense reimbursements. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then Denise noticed several names repeated dozens of times. These deputies were paid for shifts they never worked. The technician enlarged the spreadsheet. Thousands of dollars had been approved each month. The signatures authorizing payment belonged to Sheriff Randall Whitmore. Aaliyah looked at Denise. This could be fraud. Denise answered quietly, It is fraud. But we still need to prove intent. Then they opened the folder marked call logs. Phone records stretched across several years. Repeated calls, same numbers, judges, local business owners, county commissioners, tow truck companies, even newspaper editors. Denise stared at the screen. He wasn't just protecting Dylan. He was controlling the entire narrative. The room fell silent again. Then Aaliyah noticed something else. Who's this number? The technician enlarged one entry. No name, only hundreds of outgoing calls. Nearly every major incident involving Dylan was followed by a call to the same unknown number. Denise wrote it down. I'll have someone trace it. Finally, the technician clicked the last folder. Do not delete. Everyone instinctively leaned forward. Inside were only 3 video files. The first one loaded. It was security footage from the gas station, not the edited version spreading across social media. The original, crystal clear. The video showed Dylan refusing repeated lawful commands. It captured him knocking Aaliyah's citation book onto the pavement. It showed him stepping aggressively toward her. Then, without any obstruction, the camera clearly recorded Dylan grabbing Aaliyah's wrist first. Every movement, every command, every second, exactly as Aaliyah had reported. The technician paused the video. Oh, no jury would call this excessive force. Denise quietly smiled for the first time in days. No, they'd call it textbook. Relief washed across Aaliyah's face. For nearly a week, strangers had judged her based on manipulated clips. Now the truth existed. Complete. Undeniable. Just then, Denise's office phone rang. She answered immediately. After listening for nearly a minute, she thanked the caller and hung up. What happened? Aaliyah asked. Denise looked toward the closed office door before speaking. I think it's time you know why you were really transferred here. Aaliyah remained silent. You weren't selected because another officer retired. I suspected as much. Denise nodded. For almost 11 months, Internal Affairs and the state police have quietly investigated corruption inside Redstone County. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. And me? You were personally recommended. By who? Commander William Hayes. Aaliyah recognized the name immediately. Her former commanding officer in the Army had once worked alongside Hayes during a federal task force. He said you couldn't be bribed. Denise continued. He said you would follow the law even if it cost you your career. Aaliyah gave a faint smile. It almost has. Denise returned the smile. Not yet. She opened a locked drawer and removed a thin, confidential file. Across the front was printed, Redstone Integrity Task Force. You've been part of this operation since the day you accepted your transfer. Aaliyah slowly looked through the documents. Photographs, financial records, witness statements, maps, names. Everything pointed toward a much larger conspiracy than one reckless young man. Dylan had never been the real target. His arrogance had simply opened the first door. That afternoon, Deputy Caleb Foster quietly knocked on Denise's office. He looked unusually tense. I couldn't say this over the radio. Denise motioned him inside. "What is it?" Caleb closed the door. "I heard Sheriff Whitmore talking with Dylan." "What about?" "They know someone leaked information." Aaliyah immediately looked up. "How come?" "I don't know." Caleb swallowed. "But the sheriff said." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Find the traitor before the state police do." The room became dangerously quiet. Someone inside the sheriff's office had risked everything to expose years of corruption. And now Randall Whitmore had begun hunting that person. No one knew who would find the whistleblower first. The atmosphere inside the Redstone County Sheriff's Office changed overnight. Nobody laughed in the hallways anymore. Deputies who normally gathered around the coffee machine now spoke in whispers, constantly looking over their shoulders. Sheriff Randall Whitmore had made one thing painfully clear. There was a traitor inside his department, and he intended to find that person before anyone else did. Early the next morning, every deputy was ordered into the briefing room. Randall stood at the front with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was calm, too calm. "I've served this county for 23 years, he began. "I've protected every family sitting in this room." Nobody spoke. But recently, his eyes slowly scanned every face. Someone decided to betray this department. Silence grew heavier. Randall continued, "I don't care who it is. I don't care why. When I find them, they'll never wear another badge again." Several deputies shifted uneasily. Deputy Caleb Foster kept his face perfectly still, though his heart hammered against his chest. Across the room, Officer Aaliyah Carter watched Randall carefully. He wasn't making a speech. He was hunting. After briefing ended, Randall called Caleb into his office. The young deputy immediately knew this wasn't a casual conversation. The sheriff closed the door behind him. "Sit down." Caleb obeyed. Randall poured 2 cups of coffee before sliding one across the desk. "You've been quiet lately." "I've just been busy. You used to spend time with Dylan." "I still do sometimes." Randall leaned back. "You know, loyalty matters." "It does, Sheriff. I hope you remember that." Caleb nodded. "I do." Randall smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "If you hear anything at all, about missing files, or officers talking to outsiders, you'll come directly to me." "Of course." As Caleb stood to leave, Randall spoke one final sentence. "And Caleb, choose your friends carefully." The warning lingered long after Caleb walked out. That evening, Caleb drove to an abandoned fishing pier outside town instead of going home. Aaliyah was already waiting beside her cruiser. She had purposely left her body camera inside the locked vehicle. "So," she asked. Caleb looked exhausted. "He suspects everyone." "Does he suspect you?" "I don't know." He took a deep breath. "But he's getting desperate." Caleb handed her a folded notebook page. "I copied this before anyone noticed." Aaliyah unfolded it. Inside were several names: business owners, former deputies, county employees. "What is this? People who filed complaints against Dylan?" She frowned. Half of them disappeared from county records, and the other half, they suddenly withdrew their complaints. Neither of them believed that was a coincidence. Meanwhile, Dylan Whitmore had problems of his own. His friends were no longer laughing as confidently. The original gas station footage had not been released publicly, but rumors about its existence had begun spreading. Inside a private hunting lodge owned by the Whitmore family, Dylan paced back and forth. This is getting ridiculous. Randall remained seated. I told you to stay out of public. I'm tired of hiding. You created this. I grabbed her wrist. So what? Randall's voice sharpened. So now we clean up your mistake. Dylan stopped pacing. What if someone really has the full video? Randall looked directly at him. Then we make sure nobody ever sees it. 2 nights later, another incident shook the investigation. Harold Jenkins, the owner of the gas station where Dylan had been arrested, called Captain Denise Monroe after closing time. His voice trembled. They came back. Who? I didn't recognize all of them. But one drove a sheriff's office SUV. What happened? They demanded my security system. Denise's expression darkened. Did you give it to them? I told them the hard drive was broken. Was it? No. Harold lowered his voice. I hid it. Denise immediately looked at Aaliyah. We're going. They arrived less than 15 minutes later. Harold locked the front doors behind them before leading them into a small storage room. Without speaking, he pulled an old metal toolbox from beneath a shelf. Inside, wrapped in plastic, sat the original security hard drive. I couldn't trust anyone. You can trust us, Denise replied. Harold shook his head. I hope you're right. Just then, crash glass exploded somewhere inside the station. Everyone froze. Another loud bang echoed through the building. Someone had kicked open the side entrance. Denise instinctively drew her service weapon. Police! No one move! Footsteps, fast, running. Aaliyah sprinted through the narrow hallway toward the sound. By the time she reached the convenience store, the intruders were already fleeing through the broken doorway. A dark pickup accelerated into the night. Its license plate had been removed. Only shattered glass remained. Harold stared at the ruined entrance. They were looking for this. He pointed toward the hidden hard drive still resting inside the toolbox. Aaliyah realized they had arrived just minutes before the evidence disappeared forever. The following morning, the recovered hard drive was delivered directly to the State Police Digital Forensics Laboratory, instead of remaining in county custody. No one inside the sheriff's office was informed, not even Randall. That decision would soon prove critical. Later that afternoon, Captain Denise Monroe received another encrypted phone call. She listened quietly before responding. Yes, we have it. No. They never found the drive. Another pause. I understand. She hung up. Aaliyah looked at her expectantly. What did Commander William Hayes say? Denise smiled faintly. The laboratory has already verified the footage. And it matches your body camera frame for frame. Every edited video circulating online had just been destroyed. Legally, scientifically, completely. But Denise wasn't finished. The state police also recovered something else from the hard drive. What? She slid a printed photograph across the desk. It showed Sheriff Randall Whitmore standing beside a county evidence locker late at night. The timestamp was 2 years old. He was removing sealed evidence boxes that should never have left police custody. A second photograph showed Dylan waiting beside the vehicle. Neither of them noticed the security camera hidden above the loading dock. Aaliyah stared at the images. This is bigger than we thought. Denise nodded. It always was. Just then, Caleb's emergency call came over the secure radio. His voice was strained. Captain, we've got a serious problem. They know who leaked the flash drive. A chilling silence filled the office. Denise gripped the radio. "Who is it?" Caleb answered with barely controlled urgency. "It's Linda Parker, the sheriff's executive secretary. And she's disappeared." Captain Denise Monroe was already reaching for her car keys before Caleb Foster finished speaking over the secure radio. "Last known location. Her apartment," Caleb answered. "Neighbors say 2 sheriff's office SUVs were parked outside less than an hour ago." Denise looked at Officer Aaliyah Carter. "We're going." The 2 patrol cars raced across Redstone County with lights and sirens cutting through the quiet afternoon. Neither officer spoke. They both understood what was at stake. If Linda Parker had truly leaked the flash drive, she was no longer just a witness. She was a target. The apartment door stood half open. No sign of forced entry. No shattered windows. Everything appeared strangely normal. Aaliyah slowly pushed the door open. "Police." No answer. The living room looked untouched except for one chair lying on its side. A coffee mug had shattered across the kitchen floor. Inside the bedroom dresser, drawers had been pulled open. Files were scattered everywhere. Someone had searched carefully, but they hadn't searched perfectly. Aaliyah noticed a framed family photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. She lifted it. Taped behind the frame was a folded envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "If anything happens to me, don't trust the sheriff's evidence room. Check storage locker B14 at the old county warehouse. Everything is there." Denise folded the note. She knew this day might come. 20 minutes later, they arrived at the abandoned county warehouse on the edge of town. Rust covered the loading docks. Broken windows overlooked an empty parking lot. The building had officially closed 5 years earlier. Storage locker. B14 sat at the end of a dim hallway. The padlock had already been cut. Denise immediately raised her pistol. "We're too late." Inside, shelves had been emptied. Boxes were ripped open. Documents covered the floor. Someone had clearly beaten them there. Then Aaliyah noticed something shining beneath a fallen cardboard box, a digital voice recorder. She pressed play. Linda Parker's nervous voice filled the silent warehouse. My name is Linda Parker. I've worked as Sheriff Randall Whitmore's executive secretary for 19 years. She paused, taking a shaky breath. If you're hearing this, they probably found out I copied the files. Another pause. The sheriff has destroyed evidence for years. He ordered deputies to erase reports. He forced witnesses to change statements. He protected Dylan every single time. Her voice cracked. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The recording ended. Nobody spoke. The confession alone could destroy everything Randall had built. At that exact moment across town, Sheriff Randall Whitmore stood behind a podium inside the Redstone County Civic Center. Television cameras filled the room. Local reporters packed every seat. Behind him hung a large county seal. He adjusted the microphone. Good afternoon. I've called this press conference to address the unfortunate actions of Officer Aaliyah Carter. Several reporters immediately began taking notes. Randall sighed dramatically. After reviewing preliminary information, I have determined Officer Carter exercised poor judgment, violated department standards, and damaged the trust between law enforcement and our community. He looked directly into the cameras. Effective immediately. I am recommending her suspension pending termination. Several reporters gasped. Dylan Whitmore stood near the side wall wearing an expensive suit and an unmistakable smile. He whispered to one of his friends, I told you she'd be finished. Just as Randall prepared to continue speaking, the rear doors of the auditorium swung open. Every head turned. 4 uniformed state police troopers entered first. Behind them came investigators from internal affairs. The room erupted into whispers. Then Commander William Hayes walked calmly down the center aisle. He never looked away from Randall. The sheriff's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What is this?" Randall demanded. Hayes stopped only a few feet from the stage. "This press conference is over." Randall forced a smile. "I'm in the middle of official county business." "No." Hayes answered quietly. "You're in the middle of an active state investigation." Television cameras immediately pivoted toward the confrontation. Dylan's smile disappeared. Then the final doors opened. A woman in a dark navy FBI jacket stepped inside carrying a thick evidence binder. Special Agent Valerie Grant. The room fell completely silent. She approached the stage without hesitation. "Sheriff Randall Whitmore." She spoke clearly enough for every microphone to capture her words. "For nearly 11 months, federal and state investigators have conducted a joint corruption investigation involving your office." Randall's face turned pale. "You have no authority here." Valerie calmly opened the binder. "We have surveillance footage." She placed one photograph onto the podium. "We have financial records." Another photograph. "We have witness statements." Another. "And we have original digital recordings proving repeated obstruction of justice." Every flash from the photographers lit the room like lightning. Dylan instinctively stepped backward. "No," he whispered. "This isn't happening." Commander Hayes nodded toward the state police investigators. "Secure the building." Troopers immediately spread throughout the auditorium. No one was allowed to leave. Reporters continued broadcasting live. Every television station in the county had just interrupted regular programming. Outside residents gathered around storefront televisions, inside diners, inside auto repair shops, inside schools. The same unbelievable scene played on every screen. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Sheriff Randall Whitmore looked like a man who had lost control, and Agent Valerie Grant reached into her binder one final time. She slowly removed a sealed envelope bearing the signature of a federal judge. "Sheriff Whitmore," she said firmly, "we're not here to ask questions anymore." The entire room held its breath as she began unfolding the document. No one moved. Not the reporters, not the deputies, not even Dylan Whitmore. Every eye remained fixed on the sealed federal document in Special Agent Valerie Grant's hands. She calmly unfolded the papers and looked directly at Sheriff Randall Whitmore. "By the authority granted under federal law and in cooperation with the State Police and Internal Affairs Division, we are executing multiple arrest warrants and search warrants related to public corruption, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and abuse of official authority." The room erupted into stunned whispers. Sheriff Whitmore forced a laugh. "This is political theater." Valerie didn't react. "It isn't." She nodded toward Commander William Hayes. "Proceed." Hayes raised his hand. Immediately, 2 state police investigators walked onto the stage carrying portable monitors connected to a secure evidence server. One of them inserted an encrypted drive. The large projection screen behind the podium flickered to life. "Exhibit 1, Hayes announced. "The original Highway 17 arrest." The room fell silent again. The unedited gas station surveillance footage appeared on the giant screen. Every second unfolded exactly as it had happened. Officer Aaliyah Carter calmly issuing lawful commands. Dylan refusing to provide identification. Dylan knocking the citation book onto the pavement. Dylan stepping aggressively toward her. Then, the moment everyone had argued about. The video clearly showed Dylan grabbing Aaliyah's wrist first. There was no doubt. No missing footage, No deceptive editing, no excessive force, only a trained officer responding to an assault. A reporter sitting in the front row slowly lowered his notebook. "My God," another whispered, "they lied." Dylan's face drained of color. He looked desperately toward his father. Randall stared at the screen without blinking. Hayes spoke again. On the Exhibit 2, a second video appeared. 2 years earlier, a drunken Dylan stumbling outside a bar after punching another man. Deputies attempting to arrest him. Moments later, Sheriff Whitmore arrived. The audience watched him order the deputies to release his son. The arrest report was torn in half before the camera. Gasps echoed throughout the auditorium. Valerie placed another document onto the evidence table. That victim later signed a statement saying he had fallen down the stairs. She paused. He signed it after receiving threats. The cameras continued flashing. Exhibit 3. Financial records filled the screen. Commander Hayes pointed toward highlighted entries. County payroll. Ghost employees, false overtime, unauthorized reimbursements, more than $1 million diverted over 6 years. Every approval carried Randall Whitmore's electronic signature. A county commissioner sitting near the back buried his face in his hands. The scandal had become impossible to deny. Then Valerie looked toward the audience. "We have one final witness." The rear doors opened once again. Everyone turned. A woman slowly walked inside under state police protection. Linda Parker, alive, bruised, exhausted, but alive. Sheriff Whitmore's eyes widened. "You." Linda stopped beside Valerie. For 19 years, she had sat outside Randall's office, quietly typing reports, answering phones and watching corruption unfold day after day. Today, she finally spoke into a courtroom-quality microphone. "I destroyed nothing." She looked directly at Randall. "You told everyone I was loyal. I was. Until you asked me to erase evidence against innocent people." The room remained absolutely silent. Linda continued. "I copied every file before you deleted it. I kept every backup. I recorded every order." She reached into her purse and placed a small digital recorder onto the evidence table. Caleb Foster immediately recognized it. It was identical to the recorder recovered at the warehouse. Valerie pressed the play button. Randall's own voice filled the auditorium. "If Dylan gets arrested again, make the report disappear." Another recording followed. "I don't care what the body camera shows." Then another. "Tell the witness they'll lose their business license." Shaki. Every sentence drove another nail into the sheriff's career. Dylan shook his head repeatedly. "No. No." His voice trembled. "Dad, tell them it's fake." Randall remained frozen. For the first time in decades, he had no order left to give. Commander Hayes turned toward Deputy Caleb Foster. "Deputy Foster." Caleb walked to the witness microphone. His palms were sweating. "I've served under Sheriff Whitmore for 6 years." He swallowed hard. "I stayed silent because I was afraid." His eyes briefly found Aaliyah. "But Officer Carter reminded me what the badge is supposed to mean." He described years of ignored complaints, destroyed reports, threatened deputies, victims pressured into silence. Everything matched the recovered documents. Everything matched Linda's testimony. Everything matched the digital evidence. The truth no longer depended on one witness. It had become overwhelming. Valerie Grant quietly closed the evidence binder. "Sheriff Randall Whitmore." She nodded toward 2 FBI agents. "You are under arrest." Neither agent rushed. Neither raised their voices. They simply walked onto the stage. One agent removed Randall's service weapon. The other carefully secured his wrists behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent auditorium. 23 years of unchecked power ended with a single sound. Across the room, Dylan suddenly tried to push through the crowd. "I'm leaving." State troopers blocked his path. "You'll need to stay here, Mr. Whitmore." "I didn't do anything." Valerie looked directly at him. "You assaulted a peace officer. You intimidated witnesses. You participated in the destruction of evidence." She paused. "Your arrest warrant was signed this morning." Dylan's knees nearly gave way. The same man who had laughed and shouted, "You can't arrest me," now stood speechless as a state trooper gently guided his hands behind his back. The handcuffs closed. Outside the Civic Center, thousands of residents watched the live broadcast on giant news screens. Inside the auditorium, every camera focused on Officer Aaliyah Carter. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply stood in respectful silence, knowing this victory had never belonged to her alone. It belonged to everyone who had refused to surrender the truth. The silence inside the Redstone County Civic Center lingered long after Sheriff Randall Whitmore and his son Dylan disappeared through the rear doors in handcuffs. For years, the Whitmore family had been the most powerful name in the county. Now, under the glare of television cameras, they were simply two defendants. Outside, reporters rushed to broadcast the historic moment. Residents who had spent decades believing no one could challenge the sheriff's authority stood speechless as patrol vehicles from the state police and the FBI rolled away from the courthouse. For the first time in a generation, Redstone County understood that the law did not belong to one family. It belonged to everyone. The weeks that followed changed the county forever. Federal investigators remained in Redstone working day and night. Every evidence locker was audited. Every financial record was examined. Every dismissed complaint was reopened. Cases once buried beneath layers of intimidation were brought back into the light. Victims who had stayed silent for years finally stepped forward. One farmer described how Dylan had destroyed thousands of dollars worth of fencing while driving drunk. A waitress admitted she had been pressured into changing her statement after witnessing a bar fight. A small business owner confessed he had lied to investigators because Randall Whitmore threatened to revoke his operating permits. Each testimony strengthened the case. Each confession exposed another piece of a system built on fear instead of justice. By the time the grand jury completed its work, the list of charges had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined. Several former deputies accepted plea agreements after admitting they had altered reports under direct orders. County officials resigned. 2 commissioners became cooperating witnesses. The corruption that had once seemed untouchable unraveled thread by thread. 3 months later, the federal courthouse was filled beyond capacity. Journalists from across the state occupied every available seat. Judge Patricia Holloway entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock. The room immediately rose. When everyone was seated again, the judge reviewed the verdicts returned by the jury. Sheriff Randall Whitmore. She looked directly at the former sheriff. "You were entrusted with enforcing the law." Her voice remained calm but firm. "Instead, you used public office to protect criminal behavior, destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and betray the citizens you swore to serve." She paused before continuing. "This court sentences you to a substantial term of imprisonment under state and federal law, together with permanent disqualification from holding any public office." Randall lowered his head. For the first time in decades, there was no badge on his chest. No deputies waiting for his orders. Only consequences. Judge Holloway then turned toward Dylan Whitmore. You believed your family name placed you above the law? Dylan stared silently at the defense table. It did not. The judge sentenced him for assaulting a peace officer, resisting lawful arrest, reckless driving, witness intimidation, and related offenses supported by the evidence presented at trial. The courtroom remained silent. Justice had finally caught up with a man who had spent his entire life believing it never would. Outside the courthouse, microphones surrounded Officer Aaliyah Carter. One reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. Officer Carter, after everything you endured, do you feel vindicated? Aaliyah smiled politely before answering. This case was never about proving that I was right. She looked toward the courthouse steps. It was about proving that the law must protect every citizen equally. Another reporter asked, "Were you ever afraid?" She nodded honestly. Every day. What kept you going? Aaliyah glanced toward Captain Denise Monroe, Deputy Caleb Foster, Linda Parker, Commander William Hayes, and Special Agent Valerie Grant standing nearby. I wasn't standing alone. Good people chose courage over comfort. And that's how justice begins. Her answer was replayed across news broadcasts throughout the country. A month later, the State Police Academy held a special ceremony. Captain Denise Monroe stepped onto the stage. Officer Aaliyah Carter, as Aaliyah approached the audience, rose to its feet. The applause continued for nearly a full minute. Denise presented her with the Distinguished Service Medal. This recognition is awarded not only for exceptional professionalism under pressure, but for demonstrating that integrity is strongest when tested. Another surprise followed. Commander William Hayes stepped forward. Officer Carter, he smiled. On behalf of the state police, I'd like to offer you a position as a tactical training instructor. The audience applauded again. Aaliyah accepted with quiet gratitude. I'd be honored. Hayes nodded. We want future officers to learn exactly what you taught this state. No one is above the law. Deputy Caleb Foster also found a new beginning. His honesty during the investigation earned him a position with the State Police Internal Affairs Division. When reporters congratulated him, he admitted, I spent too many years being afraid. He looked toward Aaliyah. She reminded me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing the truth anyway. Linda Parker received protection through the state's Witness Assistance Program. For the first time in nearly 20 years, she slept without worrying that someone would knock on her door in the middle of the night. She later wrote Aaliyah a handwritten letter. So thank you for giving me the courage to stop surviving and start telling the truth. Aaliyah kept the letter in her desk drawer. It remained one of her most treasured possessions. Several months later, Officer Aaliyah Carter drove along Highway 17 once again. The same stretch of road, the same rolling hills, the same evening sunlight. This time, another patrol car passed in the opposite direction. The young deputy inside raised 2 fingers from the steering wheel in greeting. Aaliyah returned the gesture with a smile. The county felt different. Children waved at patrol cars again. Business owners no longer looked away when officers entered their stores. People had begun trusting the badge instead of fearing it. As she continued down the highway, she drove past the gas station where everything had begun. She remembered Dylan's voice. You can't arrest me. She remembered the fear in the crowd. She remembered the doubt. Then she looked ahead. Justice had never depended on one perfect person. It depended on ordinary people refusing to surrender their principles when doing the right thing became difficult. Aaliyah smiled quietly as the patrol cruiser disappeared into the fading sunset, ready to answer the next call. Not for recognition, not for revenge, but because every community deserves officers who serve the law rather than themselves.
True justice begins the moment ordinary people refuse to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. One honest decision can inspire countless others to choose courage over fear. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what integrity means to you. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories where truth, courage, and justice always find a way.